Thus far, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast has treated music, movies, books, toys, food, restaurants, hotels, even people and their careers as historic artifacts, documents of the time period which produced them. Today we're going to add roadways, 2 parkways and a city drive to be exact, to the list of irregular examples of primary sources. This is the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, and I am Eric Paul. New York City commuters don't have a lot of time to dwell on the history of the roads they use each day to get to and from work and home, but behind each paved thoroughfare is a story about the past waiting to be told. You already know actor Chance Kelly from his roles in Generation Kill, Aquarius, and one of my favorites, Fringe, but he's also the host of the podcast Island, a program dedicated to the history and people of Manhattan and the greater New York City area. Chance joined me recently to take an analytical look at the Bronx and Hutchinson River Parkways, which course through Westchester County towards the city, and FDR Drive, once one is in Manhattan. When dissected, each of these roadways reveals a tremendous amount of clues about many different time periods in the region's history. Take a listen. Welcome back to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source. I'm Eric Paul, and I'm joined today by Mr. Chance Kelly. He is the host. Well, this is among many other things on your resume. Acting, directing, writing, you name it, you've been involved in it. But of late, you've been focusing a lot of your attention towards the podcast Island, which sounds like it could be about a number of different islands, but it's one very specific one, that would be Manhattan. Welcome to the show. And could you just maybe give us a little bit insight as to what made you want to do your show specific to Manhattan?
Thanks, Eric. Nice to be here. I went to NYU many millennia, and in the last millennium, and I came upon an exhibit down by LaGuardia Place, which is just south of Washington Square Park, and it's still there. Mm-hmm. And the name of it escapes me, but essentially what it is a section of the blocks are very wide there. So they take a section that's maybe 15 feet by 50 feet, and they recreated what they believed was as accurate as they could be with the vegetation prior to colonization of Manhattan Island. And it's not that I didn't know that at some point, there was some time prior to colonization. I just hadn't thought about it. Mm-hmm. And there was just something that did to my young-ish mind back then and just got me thinking. And it just blew me away because I was very attached to New York City. I had a real fondness for it. My heritage comes from 5 Points, and then we moved up the line, and we know a lot of the same places in this greater metropolitan area. But it really grabbed me in a way, and I wanted to just know more and more about the history of this place and how it came to be. And I continued to dig, and then, 30 years hence, I decided to do a podcast about it, and here we are.
Well, it's great because, I mean, New York is New York. It's unique. It's unlike any other city. And I think most of the East Coast cities kind of would come back and say something, well, ours is very, very unique as well. Boston has its own, feel to it, Philadelphia, all the way down the line. But there's something about New York that you can never mistake in it. Nobody could look at New York in any of its iterations and mistaken it for any other place. And it all has to do with that centerpiece that is Manhattan. Like, I remember as a kid, and we've talked, before recording, and our families are from similar areas, and, upstate, quote unquote, right? Westchester County, which is, upstate to New Yorkers, that it just it calls to you. New York City has that, kind of just all things funnel into it. It's like once you hit that greater metro area, which as time has gone on, it just extends further and further away from the actual city itself. You can feel that, almost like a gravity pulling you towards Manhattan. And if listeners have never been to New York, the first time you go by road, you'll notice it, and that's actually what we're going to be talking about today. Is some of those roadways, particularly some parkways that make their way into Manhattan. And as we do on this show, breaking them down as documents of their time periods. What do they tell us about the different time periods that they all showed up? And so we're going to do our best. We're going to bounce around a little bit between the Hutchinson River Parkway, the Cross Bronx Expressway, or the
Bronx River.
Okay, yeah. And the FDR Drive, which is part of the East River Drive of on Manhattan itself. And I know that I was thinking about it earlier today. I'm like, when you look at a map of even the most neat, organized, professionally made map of roadways in the United States, the closer you get to New York, it's just a tangled web of interstates and U.S. routes and state routes. And I mean, considering that, there's the tri-state area is right there. There's, New Jersey turnpikes, and there's New York Thruway, and there's the Connecticut, turnpike, all kind of converging in on each other. And then, shadowing almost every single one of those major roads is a secondary road, and then a parkway, and all. And it just, like I said moments ago, it funnels into Manhattan. It's all just kind of, feeding into that city. And, no matter what the map makers do, it's always going to be just like a jumbled mess of colors and, all that kind of stuff. So before we jump into it, what was it about these particular roads? You recently interviewed a writer about a book that he did about the Post Road, the Boston Post Road, right?
Yeah. Eric Jaffe did a incredible book called The King's Best Highway that I first read like a decade ago. And that was way before I was doing this podcast. And as I got going on the podcast, it occurred to me, I said, oh, gee, it'd be great to get that guy and talk about the history of the Boston Post Road, because the Boston Post Road originated at, did we just...
I just put a share screen up so we
can... Oh, okay, cool. Okay. The Boston Post Road originated at the southern tip of Manhattan Island back in the 1600s, which is, again, that's the stuff that blows me away. And it is so much of our lost history. It's hard to know any of that information at this point because everything's gone, with a few exceptions. But Broadway, modern Broadway, as we know it, the southern end of it, that was the beginning of the Boston Post Road.
Wow.
Going all the way back to the 1640s.
It's almost like that era. I don't even know if they knew the responsibility that they were, that they had of pretty much dictating from that point forward what people are going to be using for their main modes of transportation, and the way that they would see everything. They only were working with what they had and what they were familiar with. But humans, we always want to be connected. We don't want to be apart from each other. So yeah, by doing that, they basically set out that network of roadways that we still use all the time, much faster than they did, but still, yeah.
Well, also the thing that was interesting about Eric Jaffe's book is that the history of that road, essentially the road to Boston, which started out in the 1630s and 40s as literally a Native American path,
right? That
the colonists would follow and sometimes take a Native American as their guide to get up that path, and that was usually a 3-week voyage in the beginning. But if you examine the history of that road, you glean the essential history of this nation,
right?
And going back into the Dutch colonization, which is really part of what I call our lost history, because I believe firmly that is our American history, though it tends to be glossed over a lot or just skipped over because they were a different colony and they were speaking a different language.
Right.
But I believe that the southern tip of Manhattan Island has shaped much of what this nation is about in total today, even.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons this overall story interests me.
It is, and is one. Yeah, the English influence has definitely overshadowed the Dutch. I was listening to the radio around here. I live in New England, and they were advertising a some kind of performance or a telling of the legend of Sleepy Hollow around here, and it was after Halloween. And they were like, well, it's a timeless story. You can tell it any time of the year. I'm like, that's actually pretty specific to the. And then they're like, and it's very New England, isn't it? Even though I'm like, and I almost like stopped to call the station. I'm like, it's not New England at all. It's very specific, to Westchester County. It's very specific to the Dutch heritage of that area.
Have you been to the old Dutch church in Tarrytown?
Yeah, we went there. We went camping
Sleepy
there.
Hollow, rather. Yeah.
Yeah, we went camping there last fall. So in October we went out, and because that's when they start all their Halloween stuff, and we got to go. We toured around Sleepy Hollow, and we went over to Sunnyside, Washington Irving's home, where they gave this amazing telling of the story, from a guy in costume, and he gave the way that he told it was so legitimate. It came across like it'd basically been passed down through generations, and the accents that he gave his characters, I'm like, I believe this guy. He had like the early versions of a New York accent, which was specific to that region. It wasn't something that could be really shared by other, communities. It was very Dutch, old Dutch New York.
I actually want to do a show up there because that church. That's the church that Washington Irving wrote about, where Ichabod Crane was walking home from that meeting that night. It all starts at that church. The character who Ichabod Crane is based on is buried in one of those graves.
Yeah.
I don't know his name. I saw his name once. I can't tell you what it is right now, but he's there.
It's quite the place to visit. And I think the reason why New Englanders might try to lay claim to it is because we have Salem, that we have another Halloween town, and it's like, yeah, but it's not quite the same, I'll talk off air with you. Actually, my cousin is a teacher in Sleepy Hollow, and so maybe she can hook you up with somebody to chat with about that particular.
Cool. Yeah, I'd love to go tour that church.
It's still functioning, still use it. Church.
Yeah, they do.
When we were there, they had a sign that said, quiet, when church is going on. And so, yeah, it's a area rich in history. So let's get right down to it why don't we start with the Hutch Parkway? I got to say, whenever I drive in that part of New York and it's one parkway after another, I get intimidated because I'm like, I'm not, used to all of that kind of, it's high speed travel, but not on roads that look like they should be high-speed travel, lots of twists and turns and things like that. So starting from the beginning, we'll hop around on this, but how was this and other parkways made, and why did they make it?
Well, they made it. The first parkway was the Bronx River Parkway. Now, there was one out on Long Island that was contemporary to that, but I don't know that it actually still exists. I think Robert Moses changed it when he made the Northern and Southern Parkway, but I could be wrong about that. But the Bronx River was completed in 1918. So, the trajectory and the history of automobiles for the most part. Yeah. There weren't a lot of automobiles in 1918. No. It wasn't like every household had one, but there was a need for it. And there was a need coming out of New York City to be able to get up to the north at that time. Look, the Bronx River today only goes as far as the Kensico Dam. That's Valhalla. That's essentially White Plains, just north of White Plains. But the Bronx River was created for the increasing level of automobile travel. Prior to that, it was horse and buggies. I mean, not that long before that. So. And it was a very experimental thing. And you can see today, it's a beautiful parkway. And, I ride my bike along the pathway there a lot. And they really did a beautiful job with it. And that predated Robert Moses's tendency. But he came in just after that. And he actually used that architect and designer on the Hutch and on the other parkways that he was instrumental in creating, including the Northern State and Southern State, the Wantagh Parkway and all that. But also, I like the idea of talking about the Hutch, the Bronx River, and FDR, because there's the roads themselves that have been so instrumental in the development of this place, which I don't, even though my podcast is called Island, I don't limit the story, certainly don't limit the story to the island of Manhattan, because, for instance, just during the Dutch colony, which is the origin of this place, New Netherland included all of the tri-state area that we know today, plus much of Pennsylvania and much of Delaware. So it was a huge swath of land. And I do believe today that the tri-state area is in and of itself its own place.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't have a name. It's not its own state. But I do believe in concept, it is its own state in many ways. And can you imagine, you know, Connecticut, and you know up that way, can you imagine not having the Hutch or the Bronx River? I feel like I've lived half my life on those roads.
Yeah, or really any of the commuter routes to get there. Whenever we visit the city, and it's been a while, but we tend to go and take the train from Norwalk, Connecticut, into Grand Central that way. And you're absolutely right. Like once you hit a certain part of, you know, Connecticut, you're basically in New York City, you know, the sphere. It's not, you know, like you're not really part of Connecticut anymore. It's not. I
mean, think of it as Texas, right? Texas is huge, but Texas could easily be 3 or 4 states.
Right.
Well, we're not that different. And yes, as you emanate out of the core of, you know, New York City, things change. Of course they do. But, you know, when I talk to a guy like you, or a guy who grew up in part of Jersey, or a guy who grew up, you know, up in Putnam County, there's a lot of similarities. We're from this part of the world, you know,
right.
And I think that's a very specific place to be from. But I thought that the 3 namesakes of those 3 parkways the namesakes themselves are so instrumental in so many ways. So I know you wanted to start with the Hutch, but let's start with the Bronx River Parkway.
Okay.
And the namesake of that, of course, is the Bronx River.
Right.
But the namesake of the Bronx River is the Bronx, of course.
Right.
Right. But who was Jonas Bronk? And while he himself was not such a major character in the overall scheme of this overall epic story, what he was a pioneer. There was nobody up there in 1639 when he emigrated here from either Sweden or Denmark.
Denmark, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Well, Yap Jacobs says Sweden, so I'm going to lean towards Sweden.
Okay.
The fact is they were very close at the time, and they were very intertwined with what was going on and developing with the Dutch colony. I mean the Dutch Republic at the time. So there was a lot of interaction and a lot of upheaval as well. And a lot of the immigrants coming were not just Dutch, not just Walloon, but they were Danish and Swedes as well.
Yeah.
And so he came and he went and he received a land patent in 1639 and went up and had a 500-acre farm in what is today the Bronx, mostly the South Bronx, but it went up further. And I thought it was interesting that Anne Hutchinson came 3 years later.
Yeah, right around that time.
In 1642. And guess where she lived? The Bronx.
Right.
You know, the northern eastern extremity of the Bronx. And at the time, I don't believe they referred to that as the Bronx. It wasn't Bronx land, but it was up above Bronx land. And I also asked Yap, I said, look, why is it that the Bronx, you know, there were so many events and people and things that happened in and around this area and in and around that area over the course of 400 years. How is it that the Bronx, the name, the Bronx endures? And he said, look, he was there first, you know, and that tends to stick. And I think that's interesting. But Hutchinson, it's funny because we know the name, right? The Hutch, the Hutchinson Parkway. But most people don't know much about this lady, and she was a pretty incredible person.
So that road gets its name from the river which she was living next to, and she only lived there briefly after leaving Massachusetts and being basically chased out, or you know.
I love Anne Hutchinson's story because she's like, I don't want to say she was the first feminist, but she was the first American woman to stand up and do whatever the hell she wanted. And she didn't do anything untoward. She didn't do anything, unethical or anything. She just had a spirit that was incredible. And her father was a minister, and he was the same way. She went from one place after another. She got kicked out of every place she lived. She started in England. She was kicked out of there because she was not Puritan enough for them. She went to, she wasn't pious enough for them. She went to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and John Winthrop Sr. kicked her out of there.
Yeah.
Because she wasn't Puritan enough for them. She went to Rhode Island, and she wasn't pious enough for the Rhode Island people. And that's how she ended up in 1642. She contacted the governor of New Netherland, who was Willem Kieft. Now, I don't know if you know anything about Kieft, but Kieft was the second to last governor of New Netherland, and tragic figure, tragic. Just lost his hold on the control of this colony soon after he took it in 1638. But his tragic flaw was his inability to be diplomatic with the natives, the native bands that were, of the Algonquin tribe that populated the entire area.
Yeah.
And he tried to use force, and his tact was to be, well, we'll tell them what we're going to do, and they're going to do it. And if they don't, we'll deal with them. That was not the way to deal with it. Mm-hmm. That was not at all the way to do it. And he was really the only director, the only governor who took that approach. So by the time Anne Hutchinson got here, that was 4 years into his term, he had started a vicious war with the local natives, so much so that the various bands of these Algonquin groups, they didn't necessarily associate with each other prior to this incident, but when they saw what an evil man they felt Willem Kieft was, and what a threat they felt he was to their lives and their livelihoods, they band together, all of them. And they essentially said, this is all out war, unconditional war. And that's how she died. Yeah. She only lived there, Split Rock, right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's where she settled with her family. 7 of her children, she had 15 children or 14 children, but 7 of them, and some of them were grown with spouses. So there was about 15 people who had settled, including a couple of servants, up in the area of Split Rock. And they had a farm and a home that was operating, and she refused to keep firearms on the property. Now, there's not an endorsement of firearms one way or the other, but the colonists in New Netherland told her, the New Amsterdam, coalition told her, you're out there. You have to imagine, in 1642, there was nobody there, nobody up in that area. And she refused. She didn't believe in keeping arms, and she said, I have no qualm with any of the natives of this land will be okay. Well, it didn't work out that way.
Yeah.
And at that point, unfortunately, the natives were on a rampage. I believe they went into survival mode.
Right.
Because of the horrific war that was perpetrated by Willem Kieft.
And they just see her land as just part of that, and they'll make the differential, that she's not.
We have to keep in mind, there was no email, there was no mail, right. There was no phones. The communication was definitely flawed. And she moved in 1642 with her family. They may have had 1 or 2 interactions with New Amsterdam the entire year they were here, because that was a huge trip.
Yeah.
The tri-state area, the boroughs, they were up in the northeast extremity of the boroughs, and, New Amsterdam was at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. That was like a 2-week trip to get down there.
Yeah.
And I don't think she was fully informed as to the gravity the severity of the hostilities with the natives at that point.
About how long after she was killed did they name the river Hutchinson River?
I don't know the answer to that, but the reason it's Hutchinson River is the same reason the Bronx remains the Bronx. She was the first one there.
Right. So
because
it's not...
when she came down from New England, they, if you look on the map, they came down and at City Island, cut right and up that inlet that thereby became the Hudson River, the Hutchinson River.
And so it's like, that name gets extended then to the 1920s when the parkways, being constructed. And it begs the question when it comes to naming these roads, when they, eventually, the Bronx River and then the Hutchinson, why do you think that they just maintain, just retain the name of the river and not say, hey, why don't we take this opportunity and name it something totally brand new? Had the rivers become that essential to commercial and, just had they fed into the culture of the area so much,
I don't
that
think
they
so.
figured it would just be like, well, this is the road that just goes alongside the river.
Yeah, I think it's more that. I think it was the Bronx River that literally just parallels this little river the entire almost the entire time. That's more defined. The Hutchinson River Parkway, it's next to this Hutchinson River for about the first third or so, and then it's gone. Then it's just the Hutchinson River Parkway for the next 10, 12 miles or so.
Yeah.
I think it was just a logistic choice because it more or less paralleled that area. But again, you got to keep in mind, there were limited names that they could assign to these parkways because the history was limited. Obviously, the Bronx River Parkway, for obvious reasons, it parallels that river and takes you out of the Bronx and up into Westchester. And I thought, and as a segue to our third parkway or our third road that we were going to talk about, or the namesake of that third road, the FDR Drive, which, as you said, was named for FDR right after he died in 1948, I believe.
45.
It was 45, yes.
During the war, yeah.
It was the East River Drive, and that was a Robert Moses project, I believe. But if you follow the Bronx River Parkway all the way north to the Kensico Dam, where it connects with the next parkway, if you want to keep going north, that's the Taconic State Parkway.
Yeah.
And what I didn't know in doing some of this research, FDR was the brainchild of FDR.
Because that goes all the way to Albany.
Yeah.
And it's essentially Route 9, isn't it?
No, it parallels Route 9, but it's the Taconic State Parkway. I didn't realize this, FDR, prior to being governor of New York, which he became in 1928, he was the commissioner of the Taconic State Parkway Commission, which I had no idea. And that would have been in the mid-20s, early to mid-20s. He had this vision for the Taconic State Parkway, very much like Robert Moses had these various visions for all these other parkways, including the Hutch and the Northern State, the Southern State, and all those parkways. And he did eventually get it done, which I thought was really interesting.
Because I guess like a lot of times when I've been down there, and it seems like there's dozens of parkways. There's like Sawmill Parkway. There's it's just like an endless amount of parkways that you just kind of picture them as just a bit of randomness to them. But what you're saying is that there seems to have been a lot of thought because put into how they connect and what their symbolism is, their namesakes symbolize a lot of that, and that it was not as perhaps random as it might seem. Like there was some rhyme and reason to it, that FDR, for example, wanted to have that linkage between the capital and the biggest, most important city in the area.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that has to be recognized is they didn't all happen at once. So the construction on the Bronx River was completed in 1918. I believe it was started almost a decade before that, or at least 5 years before that. The Hutch was done in sections, and it was sections that were put in by necessity and based on where people needed to go.
Yeah.
Same thing was the Sawmill River Parkway. That was a parkway that existed earlier on in the northern reaches of where it is today. Robert Moses envisioned taking people up the West Side Highway, which didn't exist yet, but he had this vision for it over the Henry Hudson Bridge, which he built. And then that connects, as you know, as I think you know, to the Sawmill. That will take you up to the parkways up above.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the direct link. And that was a Robert Moses concept.
What a good last name for somebody who's leading people around. You got Moses.
I was thinking about that.
He was born to do this, and his name comes up all the time. What was his status in society that he was so integral in planning out these roadways and designing them?
My focus on this overall epic story has been 1609 to 1909. So I never really got to Robert Moses until recently. And I've only started sort of getting into his history. He was an incredible guy, not the nicest guy. Definitely there's a lot of mixed reports and opinions about what kind of guy he was. But it was staggering what he accomplished in his career that went from the Al Smith era, when Al Smith was governor of New York, until the 1970s.
Wow.
I mean, that's a long time. He built Jones Beach, just as one simple example. One of his earliest accomplishments was he was a big swimmer. He swam at, he went to an Ivy League school. I think he went to... whatever. He went to one of the Ivy League schools, and he was a competitive swimmer, and he always had an affinity for the water, the ocean particularly, and he would go out on Long Island and explore shorelines and access to waters. He would literally traipse through private property. He would go through these forests out in Nassau County, and he would start envisioning, oh my God, if we did this and we landfilled the sand and we bought these parcels from these owners, and then we could build a parkway to get people out here. It's just staggering the amount of planning and design that this guy put into his work. And I can't imagine what this greater metropolitan area would be like without much of the work that he did. I mean, how would you get around?
Right. Well, before I go into that question, I mean, think about, again, Moses, now he's dividing, he's actually parting the seas. A guy named Moses is into swimming, and, it works out so well, but, it's very much like New York and, Manhattan and the entire surrounding metro area has these different increments of time of kind of like development. And in any one period, you can only, it's all kind of like layered on top of each other. Like if I can think of any city in North America that is so layered, it would be New York. I mean, it's literally layered as far as all the different subsections of Manhattan Island itself, but around the areas as well. It's just like, a lot of these roadways were designed from the beginning to only have automobiles. They didn't want the trucks. And so that's like an era of the suburban commuter, the growth of the suburbs, that they're going to be the satellite communities to New York, and they're going to be moving back and forth, by parkway rather than the other roads, which might be clogged up by the big, cargo carrying trucks and stuff like that. And it's like, that's one time period. And then, you have the eras before that was automobiles were first starting to get going. And, that's, I guess, even longer before that. You think about all those rivers, and those were so important to the actual commerce of the city, is that, I think they called, that's where the word, the Tappan Zee is what they called the Hudson River, because it was their sea.
The sea. That's the Dutch word for sea, and
sea.
The natives there were the Tappans. Yeah,
right. So it was the Tappan's Sea. That it wasn't just, back then it wasn't a barrier. It was actually the main way to get around that you would use, the waterways, and it would wake up every morning. You would see the boats starting to head out for their daily chores and what they were going to be doing. And so it's like that's another era, that's another segment of that area's development that as time goes on, it just becomes kind of like it just folds into what we're experiencing as we're going about these roads. You don't think for a second as you're on the Hutchinson River Parkway, the detailed history of, why it's called that, and, where it goes, and, why it's always been such a huge part even before the actual road existed. The study of the infrastructure of lower New York State is the study of Robert Moses. While he and his generation did not create the concept of city planning, it was the turn of the 19th into the 20th century that made his line of work necessary and in high demand. Moses and his entire era desired functionality as well as pleasing aesthetics to meet the needs that the growth of New York City and its surrounding suburbs created. But the designers of roads, bridges, parks, and other projects did not call for a complete blank slate like planners of the post-World War II space age era would. Instead, what Moses and his peers created was a balance between the established past and progress towards the future. By having modern automobile roads retain the centuries-old names of nearby river routes, Moses and company conveyed the adherence of society at large at the time to a slow but steady transition from old to new. The second part of the podcast has Chance and I looking close at FDR Drive, the East Side Parkway in Manhattan, which is another Robert Moses project that began as East Side Drive. We discuss how renaming the roadway after the passing of President and former New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt may have been an intentional slight against the urban planner and possibly fellow New York Democrat Al Smith, too. Part 2 is available for Patreon members of the podcast as well as Substack subscribers. Visit patreon.com/EPS podcast or epspodcast.substack.com to have a listen. Until next time, this is the EPS podcast where everything, including New York metro area parkways, are primary sources.